So whilst we're all jumping up and down with joy at the news earlier today that David Sullivan has resigned his post as director of West Ham United and West Ham United Holdings, I thought I'd find out a little bit more about what this really means. Because as much as we're all celebrating, I'm not so sure the celebrations are going to last very long. Why is that? Well, for a number of reasons. David Sullivan resigning his post as director doesn't mean David Sullivan is leaving West Ham United. In fact, he still owns the 38.8% shares in the club. The only thing that he's done by resigning his post, as I said in the live show I did earlier on, is that he won't have direct, and that word is important, he won't have direct involvement in club activity. Because, as we now know, he's put out a personal statement talking about the allegations against him, and that he's going to spend his time fighting those allegations, and he'll be suing the BBC and he'll be suing anyone else that libels him. Let's see how that pans out. I'm not an expert, I'm not a legal expert. You know, these allegations, if they're true, he'll get his comeuppance. If they're not, then he'll be exonerated and see what happens from there on in. But that's not the focus I'm concerned about. The focus for me is, what about West Ham United? So, we know the facts. David Sullivan has resigned his post as director of West Ham United and West Ham United Holdings. Now, someone has suggested, well, you know, he's still got control, etc., because Daniel Kretinsky is not a director of West Ham United Holdings. That's not true. Daniel Kretinsky is also a director of West Ham United Holdings, as are the other shareholders of the club. I can't remember their names, but anyway. So we're all sort of speculating now, you know, what's going to happen. Is he going to sell up? Excuse me. Is Sullivan going to sell up? Is Kretinsky going to take over? What's going to happen now? You know, what does the future hold, and so on and so forth. Now, in the statement on the club website, David Sullivan quoted Karim Virani, who's the CEO now, who took over from Karen Brady, and he's sort of talked about how Virani will now be in control of the running of the club alongside the directors, etc., the decision making and so on. All very well. One thing that he didn't mention, which is going to come as not so pleasant news for West Ham United fans, is from what I've been told by a close source, his son and Jack Sullivan will represent David Sullivan's interests on the board. Now, I don't know how this works, and I need it corroborated by another party. You know, if Sullivan has turned around and resigned his position as director, that means he doesn't have a stake in the decision making, the ongoing matters of the club. But I've been told that Jack Sullivan will represent David Sullivan's interests at board level. Now, you can all read into this that I'm reading into it. That means that David Sullivan is not necessarily running things in name, but he is in the background. And if that turns out to be true, I think our delight at David Sullivan resigning is going to be a little bit short-lived. I don't know. You know, I can only tell you what I've been told. A close source has come up with, you know, Jack Sullivan will represent David Sullivan's interests at board level. Now, I don't know what Jack Sullivan's like. I know he, managed the women's team, or was in charge of the women's team for some time. I don't know how well he did, in that. I really didn't take much interest at the time, so I can't tell you for sure whether that was a good or a bad thing. But it certainly cut his teeth, I guess, into getting an understanding of the running of a football club. So how's this going to work out? Now, I don't think for 1 minute that Jack Sullivan, when he's sitting at board level and decisions have got to be made, he's not going to turn around to his father and say, Dad, what do you think of this? And Dad, what do you think of that? And which direction should we take? You know, I'd be very, very surprised if Jack Sullivan made decisions without consulting David Sullivan. So I don't want to put a dampener on things because everyone is rejoicing and saying Sullivan's gone. And even I, when I did the live show earlier on, said the same thing. I said Sullivan's gone, and I was corrected. Sullivan has not gone. Sullivan has resigned his post as director, but he still owns the football club, 38.8% of the football club. When you own a large chunk of anything, you're not going to sit back and not make decisions. It's a little bit like I alluded to Marinakis, who had to put his, in order to there not be a conflict of interest, because he owns 3 different football clubs, he had to put his shares in Nottingham Forest on a trust, and they run the business for him. Are you telling me that they're not consulting him on a regular basis to seek his thoughts on decisions being made at the club? I think he is being consulted, and I think the same will happen with Jack Sullivan. So Jack Sullivan will sit on the board representing his father's interests. There's no way on earth that Jack Sullivan's going to be making decisions without David Sullivan being aware of them. So sorry to put a dampener on this. I don't mean to, because I think it's still good that we're rejoicing that David Sullivan has stepped away from the day-to-day running of the football club. But he hasn't stepped away from the football club itself. He hasn't stepped away from owning the football club, 38.8% of the shares. So all the stuff that I was saying earlier could still happen. Amanda Stabley or another consortium may well come in and offer David Sullivan a substantial amount of money to sell his shares to them. Or Daniel Kretinsky could up his shares, etc., become the majority shareholder. That all could still happen. But it doesn't look like that is happening at this moment in time. I think what's key is what's going to happen to the late David Gold, now in the hands of his daughter, Vanessa Gold. Was it Vanessa Gold? Who now owns those shares in the Gold family. What's key is what's going to happen with those shares. They're still on sale. They're still not being sold. Daniel Kretinsky could go in and buy a number of shares from the Gold family and then become the majority shareholder and then have the majority say in how the football club is run. This is the key difference here. The key difference is that Sullivan may have resigned his position, but David Sullivan, has not left West Ham. So our rejoicing might just be a little bit short-lived. Look. The positives are that on the surface, he won't be involved in the running of the football club. He won't be involved in things like transfer business and all that. But from my understanding, and I'd love to be corrected if I'm wrong, but my understanding is someone is going to represent him on the board. Someone will represent David Sullivan's interests, and that person is going to be Jack Sullivan. And if it's Jack Sullivan, there's no way on earth that he will make any decisions without seeking his father's approval, guidance, comments, direction, you name it. So there you have it. David Sullivan has resigned, but is this a sticking plaster over yet another gaping wound? Have we been a little bit misled here? We've all rejoiced, and rightly so, that Sullivan has resigned, but what does that really mean in the long run? Oh dear, I dare say we might all be still singing Sullivan out, but this time it might be reference to Jack rather than David. Let's see what happens, people.